if I'm going to declare this B as well as C as virtual, we can able to avoid the multiple copies of the same data here. Constructor is a special member function. Use it to initialization purpose. Here we are not able to do any calculation. Only initialization we can able to perform. If you have constructor in both base class as well as in derived class, then base class constructor will execute first, then later on derived class constructor will execute. Welcome back to one and all. Myself, Vasanta, lecturer in computer science, Vidhyaashram, Pre-University College, Temple of Excellence, Mysuru. Today, we are going to start with third session of inheritance chapter. Whereas in the previous session, already you came to know regarding the visibility mode. Whereas the visibility mode is nothing but how data are accessing from base class to derived class. Under that, it will control the access specifier of the members of the base class in the derived class. Under that, public mode. If I'm going to write public, then whatever data functions in the base class we have, that can be inherited to derived class. Then private mode, protected mode. With that, you are studied regarding types of inheritance. That is single level inheritance, multi-level inheritance, multiple inheritance, hierarchical inheritance, as well as hybrid inheritance. How exactly this inheritance will work, that you have studied. Whereas in today's class, you will come to know regarding the relationship between classes. Then, what do you mean by virtual base class, abstract class, virtual base class, abstract class? How exactly constructor work in derived class as well as destructor in derived class? How exactly constructor as well as destructor will work in both base class as well as derived class? Regarding that, on today's class, you will come to know. Whereas first, when they come on relation between classes, if I observe this diagram, here we have the base class A. On this, we have derived class B and here derived class C. Whereas here, it gets the copy of the base class. That means whatever properties in the base class A, that is transferred to base 2. Then here, in the derived class C, whatever properties in the base class A, that is transferred to C here. Then once again, if you observe here, I am creating one more derived class by using already derived one. That means here it gets a copy. If it is come from this side, then it takes a copy of the base class, then derived class B. If it is come from this, once again base class A, derived class C. It means that 2 times it stores the base class properties. Once while coming from this side, another from coming from this side. It means that the base class properties are copied 2 times. That can also be avoided by making the base class as virtual. Whereas here, if you observe, suppose A is the base class, B and C are the derived class, which is derived from the base class A. Base class A from that derived class B as well as derived class C. In the public inheritance, B and C inherits one copy of the base class data, whereas derived class D inherits 2 copies of the base class. It means that the same copy of the base class A is copied 2 times in the derived class D. If the members of D wants to access the data members of the base class, then ambiguity problems arises. 2 times we have the same copy. That's why there is a problem arises. The compiler will generate an error. It will get an error message or it will get confused. The compiler will generate an error messages to this ambiguity. And then, to overcome from this problem, the derived class B and C should be declared as virtual. If I am going to declare this B as well as C as virtual, we can able to avoid the multiple copies of the same data here. Whereas virtual base class is a class that contains only one copy of the base class. Only one time the copy will stored. When 2 or more objects are derived from the same base class here. If you observe here, consider we have a class A that we have some properties. Under that we have data as well as function, whatever you want, you can write here. That means we have the base class A here. From this, I am creating one more class, that is B class we are creating. This will take the properties of A class. That means here inheritance will work. That means now we are creating one more class, call it as B. This is derived class. By making this A as virtual, we can able to avoid the multiple copies of the same data. Base class here, base class A. From that, we are creating one more class, derived class B. Then, before writing the visibility mode, if I am going to write it as virtual, then the multiple copies can be avoided here. From that A, we are creating one more class B. Then here, we have some statement and function, everything will write here. Then, one more class we are creating, that is derived class C. This also derived from the base class A here. By making public, I can able to access the data as well as function. By making base class A as virtual, we can able to avoid once again the multiple copies of the same data. And here we are closing that class. Then one more class D we are creating. One more class D here we are creating. And it is derived from visibility mode public for B and C. It means that D is derived from both B and C. D is derived from both B and C. From this, if I observe, here we are opened class D and here we are closing. It means that here, if I come from this D class, then A, B and then once again D. If I come from this side, A, C and then D. That means A copy will be stored 2 times. To avoid that, we will making the base class as virtual. By that, we can able to avoid the multiple copies of the same data. Now is it clear? Next, we will move on abstract class. It means that now you came to know regarding what do you mean by virtual class. But abstract class, here this class is used to create the derived class. But for this, we are not going to create any object of a class. An abstract class is the one that is not used as to create objects. Usually, this acts like a base class, but here by this, we are not able to create any object. From this, we are not able to access directly the data. Object we cannot able to create here. That is nothing but abstract class. An abstract class is designed only to act as a base class. It acts like a base class only. For example, I am going to create one class, A. Here I am having data members as well as member function, all the things. Then here we are going to close this class. And one more class, for example, class B we are creating. And here visibility mode we have to write public. Then here I am going to take the properties from A. Then here I am to open and then here I am going to close this class. Here I am having some statement. While creating the object, especially in the main program, void main, here we are creating the object, is it? No. On that, this A acts like a base class. For that, we can able to create one more class, but from this, we cannot able to create any object. While creating object A, object we cannot able to create here. This is not possible by abstract class. Only for the derived class, that is only for B, we can create object here. Now is it clear? That means an abstract class is designed only to act like a base class. But from that, we are not able to create any object. It is designed concept in program development and provides a base upon which other class may be built from this. From this, other class can be built from this. In the previous example, the class A is an abstract class, since it was not used to create any objects. Now is it clear? Whereas virtual class is used to avoid multiple copies of the same data, whereas abstract class acts like a base class only, but that cannot be used to create object of a class. Next, how exactly the constructor will work? Constructor in derived class especially. Whereas constructor is used to initialize the data or object of a class automatically. Constructor is a special member function used to initialization purpose. Here we are not able to do any calculation. Only initialization we can able to perform. If any base class contains a constructor with one or more arguments, then it is mandatory for the derived class to have a constructor. If any base class, consider this is the base class and this is the derived class. This is the base class and this is the derived class. If any base class contains a constructor, if this one contains a constructor, especially the base class, if it contains a constructor, then constructor with one or more arguments, if it contains an argument that is parameterized constructor, then for a derived class it is compulsory to have constructor. If the base class contains a parameterized constructor, then compulsory derived class also must and should have constructor. And pass the arguments to the base class constructor. Whichever argument is required for the base class, for that arguments, this derived class constructor has to pass the argument. It means that first point you have to remember, if the base class constructor is a parameterized constructor, then derived class also must and should have, it's a mandatory, it's a compulsory to have constructor and it has to pass the necessary value. Remember, we usually create object to the derived class. Usually for the derived class only, we are creating objects. Thus, the derived class passes arguments to the base class constructor. Usually, we are creating object for the derived class. That's why it is compulsory to pass the necessary value to the base class constructor. When both the derived and base class contains a constructor, the base class constructor is executed first and then the constructor in the derived class is executed. Consider we have compound here. This is the compound, for example, this is the home. Here I am having the home, for example. Here we have all the things, door, windows and all. This can be called as, for example, base class. And compound can be called as derived class, for example. If we have constructor in both base class and derived class, on that time, first base class constructor will execute, then later on derived class constructor will go to execute. For example, construction means constructing a particular memory space or we are constructing some building, consider. If I want to construct a building, first where we are constructing the compound or building, first we'll construct the building, then later on we'll construct the compound. Is it no? It means that if we have constructor in both base class as well as in derived class, then base class constructor will execute first, then later on derived class constructor will execute. If you have destructor, constructor andre kattodu, destructor andre hoddakodu. Whereas while destroying, first we will destroy the derived class. First hoddakuvaga compound first hoditivi, then later on building will demolish. Is it no? It means that if you have constructor in both base class and derived class, then base class constructor will execute first, later on derived class constructor will go to execute. But if you have destructor in both base class and derived class, then first destructor, especially in the derived class, it will going to execute. Later on, base class destructor is going to execute. Here, when we have both derived class and base class, if it is contains constructor, the base class constructor is executed first. First, the base will execute. Then, later on, the constructor in the derived class is going to execute. Now, is it clear? Then, since the derived class supplies initial values to its base class, we supply the initial values to that are required by all the classes together. Then derived class object is declared here. The constructor of the derived class receives, especially the constructor of the derived class will receive the entire list of the value as its arguments and passes them to the base class constructor in the order in which they are declared in the derived class. On whichever order they receive the data, in the same order it will go to send the data to the base class. The base class constructor are called and executed before the execution statements in the body of the derived class. in the base class as well as in the derived class, if you have constructor, then first whatever statement, whatever initialization is done in the base class, that here it will going to execute. Later on, the derived class statement will going to execute here. Then if you observe an example, use a constructor in a single inheritance. Consider we have two classes, the base class and one more is derived class. The base class name we are given as base class. First we are creating one base class. Under that, in protected, whatever data you want, you can declare here. Then in public section, base class only we will write. Then it is a base class constructor. How we come to know that is a base class constructor? It is declared in the public section. Class name as well as function name are same. And in this, beside the bracket, whatever statement you want, you can write. It means that here if it is empty brackets, empty parenthesis, then it is a default constructor. Then here we are closing this. It means that the base class constructor having, especially the base class constructor is a default constructor here we are used. In the base class, we have created one constructor. Then we are creating one more derived class. That here visibility mode we are given public. That means we can able to access the base class properties, data as well as functions. Then in the protected, if you have any data as well as function, declare. Then in public section, derived class, empty brackets we are written. It means that it is a derived class constructor. In the base class also we have constructor. In the derived class also we have a constructor. Here this will close and here we are closing the class. It means that we have two class. One is base class and one more is derived class. In the base class also we have constructor. In the derived class also we have constructor. Then which one will going to execute on this case? If you observe here, on that case, the base class constructor will execute. Here in this example, just we have constructor in both base class as well as derived class. Then destructor in derived class. How exactly the destructor will work? Already I have given an example. Consider we have home. On this, we have windows and all everything. Consider we have compound also here. Then the base class. Here we used to call it as the base class and the compound can be called as derived class. If you have constructor, then first base constructor will execute. First base will execute, then later on derived class constructor, here it will going to execute. When you have constructor in both base and derived class. If you have destructor in both in base as well as derived class, on that case, if I want to destroy, if I want to demolish, first I will demolish the compound, then later on I will demolish the home. Is it no? That means in destructor case, first the derived class will execute. Then later on base class destructor will going to execute. That is, if the constructor are called down the line from the base class to the derived class, the destructor are called just in the reverse order, in the reverse format it will call. That is, the derived class up to the base class. Now is it clear? On this chapter, you have studied regarding what do you mean by inheritance. Under that, how to declare the inheritance, which are the different types of inheritance. Then what do you mean by visibility mode? How exactly the constructor as well as destructor will work in both base class as well as derived class. Then what do you mean by abstract class as well as what do you mean by virtual class. Whereas in the annual exam, you will get the questions from this chapter, only one question in part D, that too for 5 marks. That is, what is inheritance? Explain with an example program. Otherwise, what is inheritance? Write the syntax of inheritance. Then write the advantages of inheritance. Like that you may want to get. Otherwise, what is inheritance? Explain the visibility mode in inheritance. That is, private mode, public mode, protected mode, all the modes you have to explain. Then explain different types of inheritance. That is single level inheritance, multi-level inheritance, multiple inheritance, hierarchical inheritance. That question you may want to get. Otherwise, how exactly the constructor and destructor will work in base class as well as derived class. With that, you may want to get what do you mean by abstract class as well as virtual class. These are the major questions you will get on this chapter. In the next class, we will meet you once again with a new chapter. Thank you for all of you.